This paper is an experimental study that looks directly at the choice of needle length for COVID mRNA vaccination. They looked at adults that received the Pfizer COVID vaccine, where these patients had their skin to deltoid muscle distance measured by ultrasound, and they also had their height, weight, BMI, and arm circumference measured. The average age of the patient was 35 years. They were generally overweight in the BMI category of about 29. They had an arm circumference of 37.5 centimeters and also had a skin to muscle depth measurement of about 13.3 millimeters. Of the 62% of participants that had paired blood samples before and after vaccination, there was no significant difference in the spike antibody titers between needle length groups, which might imply for mRNA vaccines that sufficient needle length is not required to get an adequate antibody response. However, what's also important to note is that a 25 millimeter needle, which is about a needle length of an inch, is likely inadequate to ensure vaccine deposition within the deltoid muscle in a small proportion of adults. So, why is this important? Well, pre-COVID pandemic evidence suggests that insufficient needle length and/or deposition into the subcutaneous fat could slow the mobilization and processing of antigens, which could affect immunogenicity and vaccine effectiveness negatively. And they found this to be true for at least certain vaccines, such as the hepatitis B vaccine, where the standard needle length for COVID vaccination in New Zealand is 25 millimeters, and a longer 38 millimeter needle was originally recommended for larger patients and also for those with a larger arm. There were three groups in this study. The first group was if the needle clearly reached the muscle. This was set if it exceeded the skin to muscle depth by at least 5 millimeters. A probably sufficient length group if it exceeded the muscle depth from 0 to 5 millimeters, and an insufficient length if it was less than or equal to the skin to muscle depth, meaning that it would be depositing into the fat. There were 400 patients in the study, 200 obese patients and 200 non obese patients. Approximately 98% of the 400 individuals were vaccinated with a 25 millimeter needle, while about 9 of the patients had a longer needle length of 38 millimeters. The average skin to muscle depth was about 13.3 plus or minus 6 millimeters, with a median depth of about 12 millimeters and a maximum depth of about 40 millimeters, which means that for the larger side patients, even that 38 millimeter needle or that 1.5-inch needle might not even be sufficient for those types of vaccines that really need to get into the muscle. However, the needle was clearly of sufficient length in about 86% of patients, and probably sufficient length within about 9% of patients, leaving it to be insufficient length for about 6% of patients. And again, very interestingly, there was no evidence that BMI influenced antibody levels between these different groups, suggesting that early antibody response to the Pfizer mRNA COVID vaccine is not significantly influenced by whether the mRNA vaccine was deposited into the muscle or into the subcutaneous fat. And this is very noteworthy because subcutaneous administration of other vaccines can reduce immunogenicity, but we're not necessarily seeing that in the mRNA vaccines for COVID. So it might be slightly less important. Additionally, the authors provided a great secondary measurement, a supplemental to BMI, which is arm circumference, where an arm circumference of greater than or equal to 40 centimeters or a BMI of greater than or equal to 33 kilograms per meter squared might be useful simple measurements to help gauge if a longer needle is needed for vaccination. Additionally, of note, the fat pad in the arm is thicker in women than it is in men, with the two major conclusions being this. The first being that the standard 25 millimeter needle cannot be universally applied for all adults, which again correlates to that 1-inch needle length. And that secondly, vaccine recipients with a high BMI and or larger arms are at risk of being vaccinated with a needle insufficiently long to achieve intramuscular deposition. Quite fortunately, they don't see this effect in antibody response for COVID vaccines, for the mRNA vaccines, but this would definitely be something to consider for non-mRNA based vaccines.